It takes about 7 minutes to drive from my church to the Allen Premium Outlet malls. And this weekend, as normal, a lot of people made the drive to that mall, and some of them didn't come home. I'm Scott Ott with Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, and this episode of Right Angle is brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. And gentlemen, normally when we prepare an episode of Right Angle, I've got a page or two or three of handwritten notes of things I want to remember and things I want to say. And on my notes for this episode, at the top of the page, I wrote Allen, Texas. And that's all I have.
I didn't realize how close that was to you, Scott. Jeez.
If we live pretty far away from our church, so if I drove from my house to the mall, it's about 32 minutes from here, traveling at unbelievably high speeds on Texas highways. But the church where Stephanie and I are a part hosted the prayer service the Sunday evening for the community, so that people could come and pray and just have a moment there with others from the community. Allen, as you probably know, if you live anywhere in the country, probably anywhere in the world, is a Dallas suburb of about 105,000 people. And the area where that mall is right across the highway from another mall. So it's a big retail, actually two other malls. So it's a really big retail intersection there. It's an outdoor place. This is the kind of a mall that you would see, like usually outlet malls are out on a highway somewhere far away from most other things. And, you're driving along the highway and then you say, oh, look, there's an outlet mall 30 miles from the last exit. Well, this is that kind of a place, except it's right in the middle of a community. And so all the stores open up inward toward this one big parking lot in the center. And a guy, clearly who has some problems, got out of his car and started firing into, the crowds of people dressed in shorts and T-shirts on a gorgeous Texas day, killing 8, injuring others. And then fortunately, an Allen Police Department officer happened to be on the scene for another reason and heard the sound of the gunfire, ran to it, and took the shooter down and saved countless other lives. I don't want to have this episode to engage in speculation on who this guy was or why he did it. I have no words for people who have suffered loss in my community here. When we gathered at church that next morning, we sang praises to God and we prayed and we read God's word and we did what we normally do. There are people from that church congregation who shop in that mall, obviously, who work in that mall. So it's very close to where we are there. But what I did notice, gentlemen, is a couple of things, both in media coverage as well as in conversations that I heard at work on Monday. Just every time you walk past people who were talking to each other who weren't with customers at the time, they were talking about this. And it just seemed to me like normal that everybody knows what nobody knows. Everybody immediately thinks they understand the fullness of the situation and how it happened or how it could happen. And that answer tends to be within the confines of your own worldview, where you already have an idea of this is what causes these kinds of things, or that's what causes these kinds of things. And we immediately retreat to those fortresses and begin to talk about it in terms of, well, if we could only change this government policy, or if we would only be more effective in that public health area, then somehow this would stop. And I'll be honest with you, Steve Green, this is not a popular thing to say, but part of me thinks you really can't stop acts of unpredictable mayhem like this, for no matter what the government would do, or at least I should say it this way, you can't stop it without what I would call an unacceptable level of restraint of freedom in one way or another. Steve, I'm not asking you to jump into the speculation bath with everybody else, but I guess, what were your thoughts as the news of this came out? I mean, you're from Colorado, so obviously you're not a stranger to, being in proximity to this kind of an incident. What were your initial thoughts? And by the way, I should add, I was at work in a retail store about 15 miles down the road from that location, and it happened at about 3:30 in the afternoon. The first I heard of it was 3 hours later when my wife texted me and asked me if I was on the way home, and then said, "Did you hear about?" And I had not.
Oh, my.
So anyway, just tell me what your thoughts were as a human when you first heard this.
I think the same thought that everybody had. Oh God, not again. I mean, isn't that what everybody thinks on this news? There have been enough of these, too many of these. But you struck home something about. This is a tough one. I'm going to have to sort of intellectualize this a bit because I don't know another way around it without just sobbing. There's a book I read back in the 90s, I think it came out in 96, 97, called The Sovereign Individual, in which the authors, whose names escape me at the moment, talked about future trends. And they got a lot of stuff right. They predicted Bitcoin without even knowing what blockchain was going to be back when they read this thing. They said that some sort of crypto protection was going to come to banking and that the feds were going to be very upset about not being able to get their hands on this money. Bitcoin came along. I'm like, wow, maybe I need to reread this book. These guys are pretty sharp. One of the things they noted is when they wrote this book, the violent crime wave that started in this country in the late 60s and got worse and worse and worse up until the early 90s was only just starting to decline at that time. And they said that the violent crime is going to continue a long, slow decline for many years to come. But what they said was that anxiety about violent crime is going to increase regardless, starting at some point, because while the number of incidents are going to decline, what's going to increase is the randomness of these violent acts. 1930s, or 1920s Prohibition era Chicago was a very violent place, but almost all of the violence was limited to between the police and the mobsters. The mob knew not to come after civilians because the police would just come out and shoot them. And that kept things relatively peaceful for John and Jane Doe trying to live their lives. I'm not saying there weren't any civilian casualties, but it wasn't like today. And the same thing was true in pre-Giuliani New York in the 70s and 80s. The crime was mainly limited to, for lack of a better word, the criminal class, or lack of a better phrase, I should say. But something has clicked, and we can debate about the reasons or the political solutions, if there are any, all day and night. And I don't think there's any point to doing that on today's show. At least I'm not going to do it, because we all know what everybody is going to say about this already. It reminds me of an essay class I had in college back at the University of Missouri, taught by a TA named David Cantwell, who said, I don't want you to write about abortion, gun control, or one other issue. I can't remember what the third issue is, because he said every word anybody could ever hope to say about these three issues has already been said. I want you to write about things you know and love. Write about pizza. Write about cereal. Write about your favorite toys when you were a kid. Just don't write about these things. And that's where we are with these shootings. Everybody knows what everybody's position is, so we don't have to do that. But we do have to, in some way, in our attitudes and in our preparations, and I guess in our souls, accept the fact that there is a randomness. And if we can't address it politically because we're too much at loggerheads, then we're going to have to address these things in a more personal way. And I'm not talking about vigilantism or anything like that. In fact, I'm not sure what it is. I'm not sure I've had the strength to look inside myself at that level, at that depth. So I guess I should leave it there and turn it back over to you, my friend. I'm sorry.
Bill Whittle, there are two other things that struck me about this. One was within 24 to 48 hours of the events in Allen, in South Texas, an individual about the same age as the shooter in Allen drove his car into a crowd of people and killed, again, 8 people, injured, I think, 8 or 9, maybe more. Others could have been more than that. And so that, of course, didn't spark a discussion about the weapon at all. And really, it was just kind of what's wrong with this guy? Did he pass out? Was he drunk? Was he on drugs? Was he a terrorist? Was he, whatever? So that they were. So there's that. Like there's this disconnect in the public where literally, almost identical death toll, but one incident sparks this big discussion around this flashpoint issue, and then the other one doesn't. And then that, and a Texas state senator came out today, and I think he's trying to get a bill passed, but he's demanding that local police authorities be much more forthcoming with information as they uncover details about the incident. And basically, it sounded like he was saying, as soon as the cops find out anything, they need to tell everybody. They need to announce it on the news. They need to show any body cam video or video that they've acquired from the scene. They need to immediately reveal the names, the motives, the social media gleanings that they have tried to do over a couple of days. And Bill, maybe it's just my training as a journalist, but part of me has gone, if you just there's evidence, and then there's a case, and then there's a trial, and then there's a line of reasoning, and there's all of that. But if you took every case that ever comes before a court and just told everybody, hey, ladies and gentlemen, here's all the bags of evidence. Go ahead and rifle through them yourselves and see if you can figure out what happened here. It's almost like this Texas state senator is arguing for kind of a gossip-based distribution of everything we know, and let's let the crowd figure out what happened. Is crowdsourcing the judicial process a good idea here? Do you think the public has a right to know every detail that the police are finding out in real time?
I think they have a right to know every detail. I don't think they have a right to know it in real time. We have seen a number of high-profile cases where the number of people, the names of the people who visited Epstein's Island, as an example, right? That's information that the public, I think, has a right to know, and it's been kept from us, it's been kept from us because those people are important. And so, to the degree that eventually this information should be released, I agree. But I completely agree with you that this idea of releasing it as we get it is just plain nuts. This is how you get people really insane, because the first suspect is not necessarily it. Everything is in motion as it's happening.
And Bill, can I say something? Because I know somebody's going to jump on what I just said, not what you said, because they're going to say, well, there is going to be no trial. The shooter was shot dead, and so it's not a judicial process. So why not spill everything out there immediately?
Because we don't know everything. We have not conducted an investigation in the fullness of time, and when you give people partial information, sometimes that information is correct, and incorrect. I'm reminded of the security guy who was accused of being the Atlanta Olympic bomber, and was completely destroyed by this. And Richard Jewell. Turns out he didn't do it, but everybody thought he did it, and when they announced him, it sounded convincing, and so we try to avoid these kind of errors. That's why we have a system. That's why procedure is a better word, right? So yes, so on that score, 100%, I agree with that. This one seems different to me, and the reason this one seems different to me is that this guy had an extensive criminal record. We can any talk about his motives, I agree, is speculation.
No, not the shooter at Allen. The guy in South Texas who ran over the crowd of people. He had an extensive criminal record. The guy in Allen didn't have a criminal record that I know of. He was excused. Was
he a member of a gang? Did he have gang tattoos?
He was excused from the Army. He had some tattoos. He was excused from the Army. He had tattoos, at least they think if they're looking at his social media account. They have pictures of tattoos that look like he was a Nazi sympathizer. And then allegedly this patch on his chest that has an acronym that they say stands for Right-Wing Death Squad. And so... Well, but he actually got certified. If it's the same guy, that's the thing. Like right now, they're still exploring. That guy has a relatively common name, and they're just like, is it this guy? But he apparently had certification as a security guard, which involves background checks and training and stuff like that. But apparently, no criminal record leading up to this.
This is then a perfect example for why this well-meaning bill is not the kind of bill to pass, because clearly the person I was thinking about is not this person. I saw a news report about this. I saw a news report about a guy being taken down in a shooting in Texas, and the guy was a well-known gang member. He was completely ammoed up. He was an illegal immigrant and all the rest of it. That story may have been 6 years old for all I know. That's another thing about when you're looking on the web. You find things, you think, you don't check the date. So this is a great example of that aspect of it. But I think there is a larger issue here that can be talked about. I don't know. Let me just say two things. First of all, your point and Steve's point is important. People say we want to have perfect safety. There's no such thing as perfect safety. Things happen in this world. You have to accept that you're living on planet Earth, and sometimes random acts of violence are inflicted upon you or people you love. It's a measure of how safe and secure our society generally is that this kind of thing still has this kind of emotional shock on us. For most of people who have lived through most of human history, this suddenly being attacked out of nowhere was the standard human condition. You were grateful if it didn't happen to you. So you need to keep that perspective there. But I think on a larger scale, Scott, I'm glad Steve mentioned Giuliani in New York, because I think that what we're seeing in America is a large-scale version of the broken windows problem. The entire theory, which was proven to be correct, that Giuliani and Bill Braxton had in New York was, if you allow people to throw rocks through windows and urinate on the side of a building, that is a signal that this is a lawless area, and that means that criminals will commit any kind of acts of violence and lawlessness, up to and including murder, because it's clearly a lawless area. The controversy was, are you saying if you arrest people who are urinating on the sides of buildings and throwing rocks at windows, that's going to cure crime? Turns out it does. Because what it's saying is that the law is enforced here. Now, I'm talking about this on a meta level now. I'm not talking about Texas. I'm just talking about American society in general. Yeah. When we are constantly shown on the news, people smashing windows in stores and looting things, when we see people burning buildings down because they have a political axe to grind, when we see all of this rampant lawlessness, and furthermore, when we see the kind of lawlessness on high levels that people are not forget punished, they're not even going to trial. What's happening is the country is becoming a nation of broken windows, where lawlessness is tolerated, and it is, in some cases, it's actually celebrated. I'm not saying that's what's driving this particular shooting, but I am saying that what this is this for civilized people is so reprehensible, because things like this don't happen in civilized countries. And in civilized countries, you punish people who have records leading up to this, and you make it clear that the law will be enforced in this land. And I think it's becoming more and more evidence every day that the law is either not enforced in this country or selectively enforced in this country. And if you have an environment like that, then you can expect this kind of lawlessness and randomness to continue to spread. The point you both made is correct. The murder rate in America is very high if you factor in these crime pits like Chicago and Baltimore and all the rest of it. If you take those out of the mix, we have a lower murder rate than Belgium. This is what I did with my number one with a bullet.
Oh, yeah. You take out, I think, 20 zip codes.
And you actually have a lower rate than Belgium. But my point is, we are willing to accept the fact that 8,000 black men get murdered in America's cities every year because we know that if we don't go into these neighborhoods, we're not going to get murdered. What it is about these mass shootings that is so appalling to us is it happens at our schools, happens at malls, places where we could be. And I'm making the argument that if we're not concerned about doing something about the 8,000 people who we just shrug off, of course they're going to be murdered this year. What do you expect, right? If you're willing to accept that there are that many murders in that many downtowns as a nation, and that doesn't cause you to have serious questions about governance and law enforcement, then I don't think you can be terribly surprised when this starts to seep out of these boundaries. I'm not saying that the mass shootings are committed by the people in inner cities. These kind of things are not. But that broken windows idea of where we allow this many murders, we allow this many arsons, this much looting, we allow this much shoplifting. We can't, when you have a society where law's not being enforced, expect people to not have any respect for the law and to think they can get away with things that would have been unthinkable, certainly in the 50s and into most of the 60s, just unthinkable. And by the way, the first of these mass shootings at the University of Texas was suppressed by university professors who went out to their cars and got their hunting rifles and took out that shooter at the University of Texas. That's the kind of society that we had then. We had a society where teachers had rifles in their cars. And not only did they have rifles in their cars and not just afraid of guns, when the shooting started, teachers started running to the sound of gunfire. We don't have those kind of teachers today.
No, our teachers today have
so
their
what do
own
you think's
personal
gonna happen?
pronouns. We've made huge strides.
Correct.
Well, perhaps it's a tribute to civilization or the grace of God that people on that Saturday were so unprepared for a random attack. We don't expect it. I've shopped at that mall. I've shopped at the several malls around there. I've eaten at restaurants that are within eye shot of that mall. I mean, that area is very well known locally. It's some parent came out of that incident after went to pick up his teenager and said, where are we safe anymore? And I thought that's an interesting question, because we do carry this presumption of safety, not just in public places, like we don't think we're going to be shopping at the mall and then somebody's going to show up with a rifle. We believe that traveling at 70 miles an hour down the highway, the car coming in the opposite direction is not going to swerve across the line and smash into us. We cruise through our lives conducting all kinds of dangerous maneuvers in the utter security of thinking that we're insulated from it for some reason. And on the one hand, that's nice. Like, it's really cool that you've gotten to the point in the progression of civilization where you don't have to be constantly checking your six. You're not constantly having to be engaged in situational awareness and making contingency plans and, saying, okay, well, if a guy jumps out from behind that, what am I going to do? There are people who think that way. Clearly, this police officer in Allen was one of them, who was ready in an unbelievably short period of time. It's phenomenal that he got there and took care of the threat so quickly. And there are others, people who are carrying concealed weapons in Texas, who think the same way. So we shouldn't have to think like a police officer all the time, but I guess it doesn't hurt to have some people who are thinking that way. And not just police officers, but others who are able, and I'm sure we'll hear stories as the days go on. I've already heard, situations where store clerks grabbed customers and rushed them to the back of the store and, secured them behind heavy doors and stuff like that. That people took action to protect other people's lives. And it's always encouraging to see the way humans gather together around each other, to see all that crowd that came to the church just to pray. Was amazing. And the very, very small group of protesters who stood outside, holding cardboard signs made with magic markers that afternoon because they knew they could get on camera if they held up a cardboard sign, were swamped by people who gathered together and said, we need to get quiet before God and plead with him. and beg for mercy and healing for these people, and for the family of the shooter, frankly. How do you go on with life after your son or your nephew does something like that? So there are what I'm trying to convey here in a very awkward and terrible way is this is a very human event. It's not a news story. It's not something that just, happened out there in some remote place. It's at a shopping mall where you can go shopping now. It's just down the street from my church. It's around the corner from a restaurant that we really like. The Best Buy is across the highway, and they're just. This is real American life, like you know it where you are, and something like this can happen. Should you be constantly on alert for that? I don't know. I think you need to have some level of situational awareness, but I don't think you should be afraid all the time. I think you should also recognize the rarity of it and just how, extraordinarily strange it is. That's why it's a big news story that runs nonstop on cable TV, because despite the fact that they say there have been however many, mass shootings this year, it's still an extraordinarily rare thing that this kind of act bursts out in a place where you wouldn't expect it and happens. So I want to be ready, and I am, but I also refuse to live in fear. I refuse to change my plans and say, well, I don't know if I want to go out in public because this might happen to me. It's probably not going to happen to me. And I, frankly, like most guys think, gee, I hope I'm sometime in a situation where I can help other people and save their lives because of my quick action in the face of an immediate threat. That's probably not going to happen either. So, my friends, I think you just need to trust in the Lord and walk with your head up and live your life and know that none of us gets an unlimited lease on this body. It's going someday soon in my case. And you just have to live your life as if it will keep going and find joy in the process. Mourn with those who mourn, weep with those who weep, but rejoice with those who rejoice, and keep moving forward. For Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making Right Angle possible.